Okay, this is this is going to be related to the last sort of esoteric psychology recording that I made, and this is hopefully just going to sort of tie things together. Someone asked me recently about describing homosexuality within my structures, which is something that I've done a long time ago within my psychological model. But now I've progressed in terms of trying to define things in terms of the relays within um, Metatype. So I think that I need to sort of maybe update some of that stuff. Although I think, I must say I'm having trouble exactly remembering everything that I described about it, but I'm pretty sure that I defined or described the kind of the homosexual psychological signature is that essentially the subconscious dominant function, um, the reason why I'm talking about this is because I'm going to segue from this to just talking about the overarching sort of how the whole thing sort of integrates, how these sections of the model are how the relays relate to one another. But anyway, in terms of the ontology of the development of the false ego complex, so it is basically that the subconscious dominant function is built out of a kind of resistance to some kind of external trauma, essentially. That the dominant function in the subconscious is essentially built out of a kind of self pity. And there are people who have these kinds of developments in their subconscious who have a dominant function that is primarily foundationally, I mean, there are large parts. The subconscious is a giant. The subconscious has in itself an embryonic um, collection of and a reading of the whole false ego complex. The whole false ego complex is in some sense represented within the subconscious. The subconscious has a lot of baggage potentially. It has a lot of beliefs inside of it. But if the beliefs that have to do with your own self identity, your own, let's say, very foundational beliefs are around the identity, are formulated in conjunction with essentially some kind of external locus of control, which the resistance thereto is what defines your own identity, then you've got quite an intrinsic, quite a deeply ingrained, um, let's say, culture in your being in some sense. And so what happens is that the ego inherits a kind of, when the subconscious is relating to the ego, um, no, I don't want to talk about that. That's too soon. In some sense, I think that there's a noxious interaction with the unconscious side of the mind, in that the subconscious does not have a proper inferior function that gets inherited by the unconscious. Instead, the inferior function becomes a kind of Trojan horse, and the subconscious is actually sort of taking over the unconscious to some degree, or there's this amalgamation of the unconscious and the subconscious. And in some sense, there's this. I mean, this is why so many homosexual individuals can be very moral people, can have a high degree of moralizing, because their individual sentiments and attitudes are generalized um, in a kind of in an environmental, worldly, um, so there is this inclination that uh, their subjective idea or feeling or judgment or something like that is inextricably connected up with a kind of I mean, I'm describing it slightly. It's hard to describe, but it's something like that. Um, People are very concerned. These sorts of individuals are very concerned with what other people are thinking or not thinking, because essentially they have a kind of collective ego. They have a bit of and this is also probably why. I mean, it can perhaps manifest overtly as perhaps some variant of narcissism as well, perhaps. But they need to know, well, I mean, in as much as homosexuality is a description of sexuality, this comes to bear in that, and this is also very tricky to describe, that essentially, um, therefore, what would qualify as intimacy for such an individual is someone who has a commonality in how they experience um, this blanket ego, the, this broadly, this broad encompassing ego that is, um, I mean, yeah. So I mean, I do think that a lot of this is essentially bound up into almost like a coping mechanism to some kind of trauma, to some degree. But it's not. I don't want to say that it's something that people, that it happens to people. It is something that they kind of fall into themselves. It's a kind of, it's a psychological strategy or tactic which they fall into using, and then it ends up, because in some sense, I mean, I can see how it would be a convenient coping mechanism with not having to muster an actualized ego judgment, but instead just according their ego judgment as being a kind of environmental worldly standard. Um, and so then people, other individuals, are scanned as either being sympathetic to that. In some sense, it makes the ego into a kind of ideology, and people are either sympathetic with it or not sympathetic with it. And then essentially, how this manifests as homosexuality is that it's very hard to be intimate with someone when your own identity has is thematically structured on resisting an external locus of control. Is sort of, your identity itself has a kind of reactive, um, it has a built-in reactive uh, um, propensity or nature. Therefore, it's hard to share intimacy with someone who cannot be categorically, in terms of the category of such a constructed identity, has to share commonality with that same constructed identity, because otherwise, um, because essentially what is being explored in intimacy is the core, uh, the core and foundational, or the deepest recesses of how the subconscious sees itself as being, um, emerging from the false ego complex. And the identity was built in, uh, relative to some great theme of self-pity. And if somebody else cannot have the commonality enough to be imagined as having access to that same contemplative, uh, uh, theme of self-pity, then you can't share intimacy with them. You can't create an intimacy bubble. Um, and so, yeah, I would say that is functionally what has gone wrong, is that and in some sense, look, because the thing is that if, I think that this happens at a very young age, that people develop a reactive mentality and a kind of an ideological, almost political ego in terms of how they relate to other people, because this is essentially insulates the ego from receiving more trauma. It kind of freezes the ego, and it puts the subconscious fully in charge of controlling what becomes a kind of static ego, which is just a property of morality or a property of the environment itself. And so, you're just scanning people to see how sympathetic they are to that standard in the ego, which is a kind of frozen standard, which is a reflection of everything. It makes, look, I mean, when I talk about the ego, it almost doesn't make sense, but essentially this is because it's all a reflection of what the subconscious is doing, because it's happening primarily as a subconscious structure, which is that essentially the dominant function in the self-conscious at its core reference of a self-identity is that the self-identity is fueled by a kind of self-pity, and therefore for the ego to relate to something, it has to have a resonance or some kind of agreement already with that same theme of self-pity, so that it's safe to open up and to have a to explore the ego with to I mean, how I've defined intimacy in other recordings is that essentially the ego gets toyed with, the ego gets hypothetically reworked, it gets reverse engineered, and in some sense the subconscious outlines how the superego corresponds to the ego, how this, because in some sense then you're toying enough with the ego to outline the real primordial structures in the superego. So the subconscious is getting by sort of engaging in an intimacy bubble, in a some sort of state of play, but in that play you're doing something very vulnerable to your ego, so that you can kind of, but when you're putting the ego in this precarious position, in that you're invalidating the ego, but you have to invalidate it by exactly inverting it usually, or by being honest about the thing that generated the thing in the ego in the first place. So you're kind of now, and I think that for homosexuals that is some kind of trauma, because it has to be the cause of what impels a kind of self-pity. So the subconscious valence, or the subconscious dominant function, is essentially knowledge according to the world. Knowledge of the world according to the motivation of the subconscious. But that knowledge is constructed out of primarily a kind of self-pity, what was done to the self, what was received, some trauma, some hurt. So, and weaving that into a societal ideology, or a political morality, or a kind of a general argument gets woven from that self-pity. And so the extent to which the people are sympathetic to that general argument, I mean, so that's when I talk about those general arguments, those are basically coming from the ego. That's what the ego is doing in order to reflect the self-pity in the subconscious. So, I mean, you could also describe this. I mean, before I described it the other way, but you could describe this then as the ego being quite sort of fastidious and brittle. Um, and so, because of let's say the peculiar nature of this um, interrelation between the subconscious and the ego, um, it basically means that when intimacy is being entered into, the other person is a reflection of the self. I mean, not exactly, but it's a like it's a whiteboard. It's a fill in of hypothetically exploring a different. Um, it's I don't want to be sort of too denigrating or whatever, but it's a kind of sort of it's a kind of autism or solipsism in some sense as well, but because in some sense the other person is just a blank canvas to help you explore. I mean, and in some sense that is true in intimacy. That in some sense you're just using the other person as a witness, but also as a participant to help you get deeper or something like that. But there is something more autistic in the homosexual variant of intimacy, I would say. Um, it is primarily. I think that also the bonding that occurs happens around the subconscious. It doesn't happen around the superego. Um, that might be a strange thing to say because I guess what I meant by what I just said is that I think that in healthy sexuality, and I mean in some sense I just want to say as well that there are many heterosexual people who will have what I'm describing. That in some sense it doesn't matter sort of the genitalia that people have if they are psychologically perpetrating the same form of sexuality. I would. So I mean, in some sense, I've this is my description of what I call homosexuality, but I think that there are heterosexuals who practice this kind of relating to people through intimacy, and it's a very anyway. Well, I guess the answer to that is what I was just trying to explain is that the reason why I'm calling it solipsistic and autistic is that the kind of intimacy that I'm calling homosexuality is just allowing you to reiterate your subconscious, not reboot your ego from the superego, not redevelop the origin and shake up the ego. And I should, I've spoken a lot about sexuality and sexual energy and psychological things. I'll just say as well that I think it is also possible to have a kind of self intimacy where you go into the connection between the superego and the ego. I think that it there might be some kinds of limits because and this is a complicated topic to broach, but when you are in communication with someone, um, there is a level of confidence, because many people will have subconscious locks, essentially, um, because they've been so conditioned to not having a completely independent internal locus of control, uh, that without sort of being able to, I mean, you can communicate with yourself through art, I guess, and things like that. And so that can be ways that you can maybe sort of unlock this kind of stuff. But to try to anyway, it can be easier with a partner, I guess. But anyway, but I'm just saying that it's possible to have this kind of phenomenological self-inquiry, not necessarily with somebody else. But it is perhaps more tricky depending on what other work or technology or tools or understanding you have, in order to facilitate it and make it easier. But it also is that other people can, let's say, intuitively, some people can perform a kind of healing, can facilitate the right kind of support that helps you go sort of, sort of having a more successful investigation, perhaps, into certain things. But anyway, I guess you would call it maybe nurturing or something like that. Or so the problem here is that essentially the thing in the homosexual sexuality is that the ego is kind of, as I said, sort of fastidious and brittle, and it kind of runs on a kind of intellectual sympathy. And so because it requires an intellectual sympathy, it can't really be I can't think of a good enough word here, but it can't really be participated with. It can't really be toyed with too much. It can only sort of just be within the spectrum that it's already doing. It can sort of vary its theme to some degree, but it can't. It's sort of it's too defensive. That's it. It's too it's too armored and heavy, essentially. Um, for it to be reworked, uh, yeah, and I mean, and this really has to do with the kind of the curse of inheriting an identity, from the subconscious perspective, which is fueled and driven and animated through the theme of self-pity. Um, because that means that whatever ego hypothetical thing that you're toying with, or engaging with, and experimenting with in the intimacy bubble, the bar is so, I don't know what to say, so low or so high, but the bar is set at a level at which you will only receive that which already gives you intellectual sympathy, therefore sustaining the self-pity in the subconscious. So all you get is kind of shuffling around the deck chairs on the Titanic. You don't get a course correction. Um, and that's, I mean, and so this is why I call it kind of autistic or solipsistic, because essentially the other person is only invited into the intimacy bubble because they are some kind of blank canvas. They are safely providing to you the intellectual sympathy. they're not participating in an experimental reverse engineering of how the ego developed in conjunction with the superego. So the superego, in some sense, I mean, I wonder. I mean, maybe the superego is being reviewed and is being looked at from the inside, but I don't think that's shared in the intimacy bubble. I think in the kind of, and again, these are loose labels to some degree, but I'm defining them in the psychological sense that in let's say in the healthy sexual connection and intimacy bubble, there is an actual shared um, witnessing of what is being outlined, or what is being reworked, or the connection between the superego and the ego is being witnessed by both participants in the intimacy bubble in a healthy sexuality. In the homosexual uh, uh, so-called intimacy bubble, it's just facilitation of of the other person visiting it, um, and there is participation in a technical sense, but it's an enabling. It's just a kind of it's the participation of non-participation, to be to be an audience to facilitate the other person, and in some sense that also, I think, is this whole project, in some sense, I think, is like a kind of addiction to some degree. It is like a kind of um, obsession. Uh, it helps to stabilize. Um, yeah, I'm making psychological points here. I'm not making moral condemnation. I'm just pointing out what I think is the psychological version of what's going on. Um, I've maybe I've been thinking about this topic. Well, no, I mean not about this topic until someone asked me about it specifically. But I mean, this is related to the topic that I was thinking about in terms of, well, how do you deal with the problem, or the what I've called the bifurcation of the subconscious, that you need perhaps a natural bifurcation, and you also have to deal with the apparition of the homogeneity between that bifurcation. That if you're going to have a worldly external identity, and you're going to have a private internal locus of control, which you could say is part of the spiritual integrity and dignity of the self, that you have to kind of work out how to manage these two things as separate categories to some degree, and so that the one can be used as a reflection of the other, and that the internal locus of control, that you can actually say that I am the kind of the prime thinker and the first cause and the agent, and the controlling agent, um, and how you uh, um, deal with, sort of, let's say, society and things like that, and having to communicate, and the burdens of the taxation of living in the world on the spiritual gift, on the private spiritual judgment that has all this magnificent control and ability. And I think that essentially you do need a philosophy of time, or a metaphysics of time, that does reaffirm self-determinism and things like that. But essentially what I think the general solution is to this answer is you have to believe yourself and see yourself as being capable in the present, and having the ability to set out um, goals and plans, uh, that you have faith in, and that you have faith in your own ability, that is essentially power and control, which is in principle the sharpest object in the world. That, when the blade of the mind is held in your hand, that it is the sharpest object in the world, and that ability, as it were, is the ability of the spirit of quickening, is how you essentially then can properly categorize, let's say, the trials and tribulations and the goals, and because I just want to say that it is important to be able to infuse your life with meaning that is self-created, that you can construct games which you are invested in seeing out, and being able to complete goals and make new goals, and be in control of your own decision making and values and principles, that you keep these things in some manner of say transcendent clarity, or transcendental clarity. Anyway, so I think that is essentially the general solution to it's very easy to generate feelings that you are, to generate beliefs, or that you feel oppressed by. But what I'm just trying to describe is that framing things like that is essentially to already presuppose a teleological purpose that would be better than the one that you hypothetically could have if you didn't have to deal with the weight of that belief. So what I'm trying to describe is that it's a indolence at the end of the day. It's a kind of spiritual lethargy. Anyway, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much, but so I would say that is the and it's interesting because I do think that there are perhaps there's almost an appreciation, I think, to what I just said in a lot of people who are homosexual, because there is a some sense that's part of the justification of relenting to the self-pity and relenting to the reactive mentality, is that people aren't capable of respecting or being sensitive, or having an immediate direct that people are arbitrarily cruel, and that the world has got these sorts of these fundamentally savagery and sort of unfair, and and in some sense the idea, well, the way to sort of cope with that is to sort of have this inflated ego that covers the world. and looks for some kind of sympathy. And I again, like this is somewhat, because as I'm describing this is something that a lot of people have. A lot of people have versions of this. I think that usually how it manifests as let's say blatant homosexuality, or what is generally regarded in the world as homosexuality, is that it's when that form of thinking was inculcated into the formation of the self-identity, because then it's got quite a deep root. Usually people will have a reactive mentality around their social mask, around their social personhood, but usually it's not deeply, um, it's compartmentalized usually, or something like that. But and what I would say, what manifests as what people would call homosexuality is that it's seen as something like the core attribute, or it's very closely foundational to include such things as the development of the basic self image, or the core reference to or kernel of the anyway. And I do think as well that I mean that many homosexuals, I think, are perfectly sort of as moral as people come. That they are the most uh, the and in some sense they have found a way to they've used their own um, I think that there are people that can develop an appreciation of their own internal dysfunction, that they can create a kind of compartmented, counteractive, sort of um, diagnosis, and also use that basic insight, because there is, as I've said, is that this reactive mentality is almost a very common theme in all, um, let's say, irresponsible or thinking, or sort of automatic, sort of narrative dependency, or whatever you want to call it. And so I do think that there are, I don't want to name names and things like that, but there's homosexual intellectuals who, in some sense, that they are plagued perhaps by their private demons privately, and publicly and intellectually. They have quite a lot of spiritual insight over these things, and in some sense they perhaps know that there is something deeply, there's this kind of tumultuous self. I don't want to say things that sound too pejorative, but that because to even label it something, because in some sense it's more a kind of isolation. I do think of it as fundamentally a form of isolation. Um, in the aggregate. Uh, and that they're sort of self-harming by indulging in this isolation. And continuing to see how far they can sort of play it out, or explore some permeation of it. Um, because in some sense it is very self-aggrandizing in terms of the ego. It does place a certain universal value on the ego, which in some sense it seemingly has a kind of technical sweetness in terms of how you can milk the ego for special insights, for because as soon as you have a personal attitude or sentiment, you can sort of, it's almost like having a sort of a Kantian categorical imperative emulator built into your ego. I don't want to. I'm not making a slight against the categorical imperative, but I'm just saying that in the what I'm talking about in the homosexual sense is that that it's fueled on a kind of self-pity. Is essentially the problem with this particular intellectual artifice. And that means that there is a particular tax, there is a particular cost, I think, in the quality of the intimacy, in that there is only the participation of the non-participation in the witnessing of the structure of the superego and how the superego relates to the ego, that can never no one, that can only be seen as an autistic isolated the other person can help you facilitate to take you into that, but you can't both see that. In some sense, you can only see the reconstruction of the subconscious in real time. You can see the toying of it within the subconscious, and you can see the which I do think is a kind of is not the same level of, it's slightly more crude, and in some sense it has some I'll just say that, this is why I think that there's such there's a higher rate of superficiality within the kind of the homosexual paradigm, or sort of the needing to explore these things not in terms of a commonality, or in terms of or an obsession or something like that has to do with how it affects a commonality, in terms of how the identity of the subconscious grounds itself. And there are elements of this which will be in heterosexual things, and usually those things can sort of be melted away. They can kind of be worked through, or those are sort of the outer layers that keep the that are the perimeter fences of real deep intimacy. Um, because people do have, these sorts of, well, I mean, women especially, in my mind, have a lot of this kind of, that kind of sort of baggage and things like that, or perhaps everyone does in some sense, or can have. Well, I mean, I guess it's all. I mean, I guess it can be all over the place depending on. Some people will have a subconscious that might have a lot of baggage on sexual content. Other people might have baggage on no baggage on sexual content, but a lot of baggage, on some other sphere of beliefs, or something like that. That it's, sort of, it can be all over the place in that sense. Anyway, I'm going into too many tangents. Okay, so let me just talk now about the overview of my model of psychology. So, talking about the subconscious. So, it's important to note that basically the subconscious is fundamentally connected with the ego. In a direct way. It's also, and it's asymmetrically linked to the unconscious and the superego as well. I think it's almost not even worth talking about how it's linked to the superego, but the important thing that I want to emphasize and point out is that okay, so the superego is kind of gets downloaded into the ego when the ego is inventing itself. Then the ego tries to set up itself to be completely independent of the superego, because in some sense it's just kind of a mirrored it's some kind of mimicry. It's a sort of it's created itself on a hope and a prayer and a dream sort of thing. And the only way that it can become a real boy and not just a kind of Pinocchio is if it has a subconscious, because then it can stabilize its circuit. And so the subconscious ends up being a reflection of how the superego was essentially received by the ego. And the subconscious then has a whole history of the false ego complex, in terms of its sense of self-image, in terms of its residual self-image, in terms of collecting all of its beliefs and constellating them around some kind of sense of self. But anyway, so it's just libraries and libraries of belief. And the ego is just basically your conscious judgment, your judgment in real time. And the superego can generally be seen as, let's say, a kind of objective psychological context, which in some sense, I mean, I don't even know how to describe it, in a kind of in an empirical sense. I mean, I guess that the superego has something to do with genetics or brain state. That it's sort of it's hard coded in some sense. I imagine that you just kind of you already start developing it. I think even from a cellular level, perhaps. Anyway, that your metatype is already set, or maybe only from sort of when the brain starts to develop. Sort of. Maybe when you get into certain structures of the brain developing, that's when it's is kind of when it gets formed, sort of 4 months in or something. But anyway, that's perhaps a strange thing to say, because my model of where these things are is that they are all within the 17 dimensions of psychological reality, and so the superego will be somewhere within those 17 dimensions, and that will automatically determine what dimensions correspond to the ego, what dimensions correspond to the subconscious, and what dimensions correspond to the unconscious. Okay, anyway, I just wanted to say as well that the subconscious is very close to the original structures that develop. I mean, well, in some senses, right? Because there are only four sides of the mind, and it's the third side of the mind, if my ontology is correct, that it goes super ego to subconscious. So it's the third thing. But the thing that makes it important is that it's kind of the first thing relative to the unconscious. So relative to the unconscious, the subconscious is the first side of the mind, kind of from a sense of epistemology. So like in terms of, because it is the holder of all beliefs, and so you have a it really is the genesis of epistemology. And so even though it's the third thing down in terms of ontology, and the thing is that I do think that it is in some sense the first thinker. It is the primordial basic sense of self. Is the most native and naive sense of self. It can issue the first reaction to things, and so the whole spiritual conundrum gets repeated within its own ambit, within its own subject matter. So you have to work out how to overcome the mind within the mind. You need some mental structure in order to have an overarching rationale, but the rationale in some sense can only be contended from the unconscious perspective. And so, and the unconscious and the subconscious are although they are neighbors, they are not integrated in the same circuit. It's kind of like the unconscious deals with certain leftover matters. Anyway, and the unconscious is directly connected with the superego. So the superego and the unconscious have a kind of direct relay with each other, and the ego and the subconscious have a direct relay with each other. And so the subconscious has to work in tandem with the unconscious, which is at the same time implying the superego as well. And it's sort of a fire and water kind of that the subconscious is the fire of the mind, and the unconscious is the water, the digestive drink. So the mind is always becoming something, and the unconscious is can't remember all the alchemical terms, but what is congealing into a there's some beautiful alchemical terms that I can't even if I had the word in my head, it would be tough to pronounce. But anyway, but the principles can only be known through the unconscious in some sense. principles are fundamentally held and rooted in the unconscious. And the reason why it's called the unconscious, and I guess I need to clean this up, is that because you don't know what it is that you do. Because to know what it is that you do, you would have to have an objective frame of reference. So you have a subjective sense of what you do, therefore it includes the unconscious. And in some sense you could say that principles, then you are ruled by principles which kind of have a kind of fractal nature to them. They are somewhat inexhaustible and lead you on to other principles. And so, the unconscious is fundamentally governed by mystery. The mystery of this, the mystery of that. And there is a kind of mysteries that are more important than other mysteries, and there are mysteries that end all mysteries. And I would say that there is a stable resonance that you can construct between the unconscious side of the mind and the subconscious. And I think that this is very much like in Plato's divided line. This is the second segment and the third segment, the greater of the lesser and the lesser of the greater. And this is where all the heavy lifting is done, because in some sense I think the ego is like the greater of the greater. It must be considered in some sense a solid state, with the superego as well to some degree, although it needs to be conceptually pinned down and seen and understood. And if it cannot be properly surveyed, you can't get the mechanics right. So you can't just kind of ignore it and take it for granted. But in some sense, and this is why you're stuck in mystery even as you are trying to. I mean, my general idea is that you have to kind of put the subconscious into a dormant daze. You have to actually sort of suspend the subconscious, just so that you can understand the unconscious, the principles, the ego, sort of the judgment and how that can be, I think, seen as being governed by ideal forms in some sense, high metaphysics, issues of God and some kind of deep metaphysical structure, and that can support things like dualism or some kind of bifurcation. But in some sense, you're looking to field all the structures that are there, and how it's been maybe corrupted, or how it's been fragmented, or how it's been mistreated, and what its ontology and origin story is in terms of your particular access to it. So sort of as an ideal, as an objective philosophical a priori ideal, it can be explored hypothetically, but in particular you also have your access of it or to it, that has perhaps so you're dealing with the aftermath, but you can't deal with the aftermath of the subconscious or the content of the subconscious if the subconscious is still piling on new content. So you just have to kind of turn your back on it while you focus on how to work out the relationship between the unconscious and the ego. And then the superego, which I think is in some sense the lesser of the lesser, the smallest segment of the divided line, was the initiating objective context, the earth and the food that initiated all of this incarnated drama of appetites and such. But and sort of plumbing the depths of those fundamental I mean, in some sense, I would say and this is somewhat unfair to say, but the reason why we fall into incarnation, I would say, in terms of phenomenologically, mentally, psychologically, in terms of the false ego complex, is essentially for the lack of a perfect unconscious side of the mind. Is that because the unconscious side of the mind is not fully developed and mature and pristine, because it hasn't had the requisite experiences, and you can't really say that principles don't get uncovered from experiences quite exactly, but it hasn't had the basic materials in order to congeal and precipitate a digested yeah, so I mean, you could say, well, if the mysteries were all finished already, then there wouldn't have been any problem. But yeah, that's not really something that I think can be remedied exactly. But because if it isn't self-actualized, then can you really have a choice or freedom or ownership of it, or to put it another way, sort of direct access. So anyway, so anyway, I'm just basically trying to say that the subconscious is kind of like the ontological, the epistemological beginning point, but the superego is the ontological beginning point. And so it's weird that you go from the smallest segment of the divided line, using that as an analogy, perhaps it's not such a great analogy, to the fourth segment. From the fourth segment you get the second segment. So I mean, taking the analogy as in the superego is the first segment, the ego is the fourth segment, and the subconscious is the second segment in the divided line. And I think how you have to I do think you can only sort of get the principles right by sort of sequestrating out the subconscious and just looking at the unconscious and the ego. And by doing that, you'll also uncover, at some point, the back door on the other side of the ego, and let's say the superego underneath it. And anyway, which you can make a matrix metaphor out of that very compellingly, I think, in terms of the detailed narrative of the matrix. It's very well written, if I do say so myself. so yeah, I think that the end game is, though, that after you work out what the ontological deficits and defects are that cause certain features in the matrix or bugs in the ego and things like that, that then again, like the final thing is, I guess, is kind of the subconscious and the unconscious is probably the thing to resonate in some kind of harmony, because they're not directly connected. But that maybe is the sort of the art of the end game, as it were, in terms of transcendental self-actualization. That requires, a kind of self-mastery and integration between these things that are happening between the sides of the mind and such. And I have outlined what a general solution in the subconscious is, but I think that there are processes that can ameliorate certain hold-ups that people will have in terms of the ontological narrative and, let's say, reactive mentality, and how that narrative imposes itself on the self, or on the belief constellation that relates or interrelates with a sense of self. And so, sort of the identity is the sort of one of the final bosses. But that identity in particular, how it was particularly cultivated or developed within one's decision-making tree in terms of one's particular ontological construction of their beliefs, all housed in the subconscious. Okay, now I'm sort of just repeating myself. I didn't talk about how the unconscious was connected to the superego. Perhaps I didn't even define the unconscious that well. But it is the subjective sense of what you do, and that sort of I've also described it before as sort of having some kind of thematic correspondence with Keegan Stage 3, and I think it is related to Keegan Stage 3 that that generally you have to have an image of what you do from beyond your subjective sense of self. And that's why it's called the unconscious, is because you can't know an objective sense of self, but you still have to try to make a framing of such. And so that's why I call it sort of the hotbed or the seat of principles, because that's the only, that to me is the then how to responsibly construct an unconscious side of the mind. Is that you're confronted with things which are sort of that have an infinite objective grasp in principle, but sort of the only things that the unconscious can be made out of is, I think, the only safe thing that it can be made out of, other than a kind of mysticism or magic. I think that essentially I think it's fundamentally correct to say, well, if you're learning about principles that you don't already know, you receive them through mystery, but to not be a mystic in reveling in mystery, but actually wishing the mysteries to be to give forth and precipitate principles that then you can. I think that has to be how the unconscious side of the mind can be responsibly contended with and conceptualized and understood and related to. That's sort of the healthiest way to relate to it. And I think sort of the scientism framework is a deep, dysfunctional, pathological, psychological engine of a kind of brittle intellectualism, a kind of pseudo-intellectualism, a kind of morally impoverished. It comes with a whole host of defects and hubris and semantic game playing and trickery and sort of cerebral histrionics and all these sorts of weird things. But the idea that there is some kind of, anyway, that might be a good angle of trying to describe narcissism as well, that the unconscious side of the mind is framed as a concrete, objectively quantifiable paradigm or field or arena to make conquest about or within. I have to think about that, yeah. I mean, I guess I am reframing and redefining some things in terms of all of these sides of the mind. I guess I didn't do that much original work in this recording, but maybe it's just a kind of a small recap. This is an addendum, so yeah, I just want to emphasize sort of two features, because as I've already noted, that what I'm calling sort of the homosexual psychological mechanism within the psychological model is a generalized phenomena. It's a phenomena that is quite it is involved in many other ways in people's psychology. It's things that many people have some, in some sense, like scientism itself could be seen as almost like a sub-variant of it. But the thing is that might be somewhat relatable to it. But in some sense, I think people that develop scientism, they develop it later in their mentality. It's not quite core foundational, and so it doesn't really affect their sexuality, their intimacy, and it doesn't become an obstacle or a preconditioned. It doesn't really necessarily influence their. It's kind of compartmented in a different subject matter. It only rules a compartmentalized part of their being, or a compartmentalized part of some sub collection of beliefs that might have a kind of metaphysical overarching purchase on the whole being. But these people, I think, are fundamentally, I mean, I put Sam Harris in this camp, that his intellectualism, he tries to create an integrated overarching sort of system and metaphysic, but it's only got a kind of semantic claim at doing that. It's not really whereas what I think manifests as what is commonly referred to as homosexuality is that it is actually much more comprehensive and cohesive in terms of so how I see this manifesting is that generally speaking, homosexuals have a much more what's the word? Their egos are are seen as just like the fabric of the world, like the metaphysical shared fabric of the world. It's and so there is a there is a kind of almost existential security in that they're just automatically projecting their ego onto the environment, onto almost like an external locus of control as well. Um, and it also, and I've really tried to explain that this has positive attributes to some extent because they then have developed an ego and they've developed apparatuses in terms of how they've structured their ego that, let's say, automatically generalize certain attitudes and sentiments. But also, what this does is it gives, as I've tried to say, that the ego is much closer to the ontological origin story of the false ego complex. The subconscious is the epistemological substrate or the epistemological beginning of the epistemological narrative of the false ego complex. Um, Homosexuals, therefore, will have a much more comprehensive epistemology at perhaps at the cost of their at the cost of reworking the ontology to some degree, or sort of or disregarding the ontological sense of things. So they've kind of got a predominant epistemological structure um, at the expense of the kind of the ontological, and in some sense that is because, well, the subconscious is it has got a much more cohesive way of organizing itself, that it's much more comprehensive and cogent. So the subconscious is much more self-consistent. Um, and this is mirrored in having what I've spoken of before as a kind of as a fastidious and brittle ego that is blanketly projected onto the environment. Um, and that also, in some sense, that safeguards the ego, or you could actually say the inverse, that it makes the ego have to do a lot of work, and it safeguards the structure of the subconscious, which is, in some sense, I think the best way to describe it is thematically organized around a kind of self-pity as being the vast, so the trauma or the self-pity that underpins the trauma that underpins the self-pity, but essentially that it's kind of like that there is some strong belief around self-pity being the glue that holds the being together, and that in some sense needs to be the glue that holds the world together. And so there's a kind of sympathy-based moral project that has a kind of social or political kind of edge to it, or a kind of or sort of is the idea of having some kind of cultural model that will people need to link up and have sympathy with this. And in some sense, this is the way of the world, as it were. And so things that have nothing to do with what is generally regarded as homosexuality have the same tendency in it. This is a common recurring mechanism in many different subject matters and many different spheres of life. But and there are people that probably have just as much of a kind of toxic uh, um, reliance of this mechanism that don't present as homosexual. So, I would basically say that that using this as the definition of homosexuality, that there are different species of homosexuality in some sense. Um, and also, I've tried to explain that some people undergoing this, therefore, can actually have a front row seat to deconstructing and seeing this within themselves and seeing that there are alternative psychological schemas, there are, and knowing that, that there is something fundamentally sort of broken or missing, which, quite sadly perhaps reinforces the general sort of self-pity impetus, and in some sense, because this has been the core sort of self-definitional. See, as a self-definitional pillar, if you're going to sort of define one of your prime beliefs that anchor your own identity as self-pity, you've created a subjective interface into knowing everything. So, like if your prime metaphysic in your belief structure is self-pity, you've got you've got prime access to systemizing uh, and ordering and knowing and sort of being privy to all important sort of things. And if you can develop a culture around that, a structure around that, beliefs around that, those beliefs have a kind of universal quality to them. They have a kind of metaphysical quality to them. So you've got beliefs which are a little bit abstract, but essentially kind of bulletproof. And so your ego can be very sort of caustic, and 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 whatever sort of ground that it holds, it can sort of hold it under any kind of fire to some degree, and the subconscious can just sort of grow more cynical under the umbrella of those ideal positions which are, and judgments which are performed in the ego. Um, I don't want to get too sort of stereotypical, but you can almost see that there is this. I don't like using necessarily stereotypes, but perhaps people will forgive the illustration that within the kind of the homosexual affectation and the kind of how they sometimes, if you can stereotype how homosexual people communicate, that they're even between lesbians and male homosexuals, there is this common trend, I would say, that there is almost a kind of Mott and Bailey tactic of rhetoric of how people can prevent people can present a kind of a punchline or a conclusion which is kind of cynically entrenched or sort of bulletproof, that sort of that you set up a kind of a little bit of a dramatic storyboarded, sort of argument or sequence of juxtapositions that then lead you to a kind of cynical Mott and Bailey defended conclusion. And I do think that the generic overarching quality that this owes itself to is that it's grounded essentially in self-pity. Or some kind of modicum of sympathy which is necessary between people. So perhaps which is connected to this. So let me just talk about. This is perhaps too speculative to talk about some kind of therapy, but I think that now this can be probably hard to tackle or to deal with because at the level at which the people are performing patterns, habits, behaviors in adulthood, um, communication patterns, and things like that, these things have within them ingrained a whole sort of enculturated, developed decision tree and relates to a whole system of beliefs. And to tackle their beliefs at the core while also um, uh, engaging and participating in habits and things like that that are fundamentally relying on these beliefs or implicitly relying on these beliefs. Like how do you reach the deep beliefs while you're still performing and in the rut of something. Stuck in a rut. And I think it can be hard because even if you have a conceptual solution to the deep thing, you've got habits and you've got patterns and you've got patterns of thinking and cognition, which are perhaps deeply ingrained and habituated. So I mean, I think you have to kind of do this slowly in a kind of self-consciousness, and you have to work out decent halfway houses and sort of make aggregated you need something of probably some kind of planned, what they call in manufacturing, planned obsolescence. And you have to do that perhaps on a pragmatic way, that you are by in a piecemeal way reframing the purpose, the teleological groundwork that you operate from, and moving from halfway house to halfway house in terms of uh, working from a different, deep, fundamentally uh, different kind of outlook. And this in some sense can be fundamentally locked down with certain juvenile beliefs, which essentially make the self-pity solution the operative and intelligent and or even practical solution. Because if you have, well, if you believe somewhere inside of you, if you made the belief one day, if you created or absorbed or were imprinted by the idea that, well, you know if you have these experiences, they leave this imprint on you, and they encode for certain kinds of affectation, or that you kind of imprinted this way, or you sort of and this might need some kind of particularized reassessment of your own young mind, and remembering that one did have these ideas and beliefs, and like these almost metaphysical ideas and beliefs, these moral arguments that one fell into, um, that one assented into constructing um, a model of the world and interacting with it. Um, and this kind of perhaps I can't talk too much about this because I I myself don't know all the useful tools of creating, destroying, and sustaining those artifacts of one's beliefs. But I do think that essentially you have to have a conscious ability to sort of survey and investigate and be able to adapt and beliefs within an integrated conscious sort of holism. And I do think operating from a holistic set of beliefs which are, let's say, fundamentally empowering, that essentially you're operating from first principles, which means that you can see how your beliefs serve your values, and your values aren't values which are imprinted onto you but from an external locus of control. They're values which you choose freely. And so that is your core. That I think is that is the destination, essentially, because then you are fully responsible and accountable and in control of your own created meaning, and fully epistemically accountable for your own interpretation. Anyway, I mean, I see the need to have this kind of radical self-determinism, which I've kind of already mentioned about, which I don't want to recapitulate, but sort of that you have to deal with the issues of bifurcation between the private spiritual judgment and the public identity, which will always have a kind of spiritual tax. The work of the crucifixion will always be attached to rendering to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and I do also believe that there needs to be a certain level of respect for the world in order to allow this bifurcation, this distinction and discerning between the spiritual character, and to be able to spiritually name the things in the world so that one can live apart from it while being within it, because everything has a mysterious worldly wrapping at the end of the day. And you will also have a tendency and a propensity to homogenize and try to blur these lines, and that is probably something like the mysterious manna from heaven, which the communion is pedagogically, collectively consuming in order to fuel also the progress of the worldly vehicle, as it were, or to the earthen vessel. So there's a dynamic dualism, I think, here. That is part of the joy of quickening, of being a member of the quickening spirit. What do you give to the spirit that has all the power and truth and full control from self-determinism? What's the only present that you can give them? Well, you give them an incarnated valence to tax that spirit and keep it quickening. It's somewhat a game. It's a kind of anyway. I mean, I'm sort of summarizing these things, but and in some sense, it's a game that can't fundamentally be perfected or be perfectly won, because then the game would end. And so you have to sort of have this respect for law and respect for, in some sense, conserving the world and conserving the bifurcated distinction between the spirit and the world, between the spirit of man and the spirit of God. That if we lose these categorical distinctions, and so I mean, I do believe in sort of creating and I guess perhaps I could be argued that I'm trying to make an ego, sympathy, intellectual claim or something like that, that I'm trying to create a worldly version or dominion or something like that. Anyway, I'm not even going to treat that paradox that seriously, because that is the kind of skeptical argument that can always be laid at the feet of anyone who is alive. You can always say, well, no, you're not wrapped in the world, you are a part of it. You need sort of, you need a more particular argument or a more particular accusation or a more particular some sense. In the only way that you can sort of get someone is in arguing about the law itself. There is this, which is why essentially the character of the law in the world is something of a deeply spiritual. It is somewhat deeper than other, let's say, worldly arguments and issues, because yeah, I mean, people would, even if they didn't agree with me, they would see that there is this, just in terms of Christian doctrine and things like that, that there is this vast emphasis in the doctrine about the status of the law, about the importance of law. Which is, I do think that there is a kind of, it's part of the Christian, the basic sort of Christian necessity, is that there does need to be something of a kind of, not exactly, but a kind of Christian colonization of law. And I mean, this has been played out in history, that the influence of Christian culture and how it has shaped, certain legal concepts and legal culture and certain ideas about certain basic things like rights and things like that, and how they should be constructed, and sort of what their teleological sort of purpose should be. Because in some sense there does need to be a kind of a secular structure that creates a certain amount of spiritual clarity or a certain amount of order in which you're capable of maintaining a bifurcation between the world and the spirit. So, I mean, I would argue that the reason why there is so much focus of the law within the Christian doctrine is what my general thesis is always talking about, is the importance of the basic distinction between the Spirit of God and the Spirit of man, between the world and the Spirit, between the world and the truth, that these things need to be, those fundamental categories are needed in order just to sort of sustain a sane psychological picture of things. Otherwise you lose self-determinism in a narrative of identity, or in some creed of vicarious redemption, or some kind of, fatalism. It becomes so unpersonal. It becomes, you're just a pawn in a giant cosmic destiny narrative or something like that. You're lost in the story, and it's all impersonal, and there's nothing spiritual about it as far as I can see. It just has a kind of everything is a means to some ends, which is not really something that's understood. It's just something that one gets enslaved to surrendering in the name of, or something like that. And then what is that name really? It's just it's just a label. It's not even known in the subjective understanding, in the subjective light of reason. There's no connection. It's the paradox of the spirit of man, because a spirit is a purpose, and if the spirit of man is a vessel, is an earthen incarnation. So the spirit of a man is the spirit of a vessel. So knowing that you are a vessel that needs to hold something is like a double negative. The vessel that holds a spirit that it knows that it's a vessel, well then it's a hollow. Whereas the Spirit of God, that we are in the likeness thereof. And what is God? God is the only true Spirit and love. And in John, it's very clear that that this is a culture. This is a spiritual culture in First John chapter 5. Um, anyway, let me stop. I'd just like to point out that I am sensitive to the appearance of a kind of paradox that I have uttered myself. I don't believe that it's essentially saying that, oh yeah, well, if you're involved in law and if you're interested in law and you think that your ideology has to do with law, then aren't you part of just another dominion in the world trying to claim things? But I mean, in some sense, this is not law in the sense of that there must be a worldly law. It would be nice if there is, let's say, a general cultural recognition of, let's say, basic categorical philosophical, sort of things. Would be nice, but it's not necessary. In some sense, this law could just be a privately contended, it could be powered just by freedom of conscience, which is a kind of inalienable right, I think. It's not even possible to deprive people of that right, even if the culture pretends that it can. It doesn't actually get to do that. That there is there is a basic freedom in the primacy of one's conscience. Obviously, you live in a better culture and society when there is a general cultural respect for that or reification of that common value or something like that. But anyway, so I just want to say that I am sensitive to the paradox that, oh well, you want to get involved in law or something like that, then aren't you just another sort of, aren't you trying to enforce an intellectual sympathy with your ego judgment? And I mean, that is just that is part and parcel of the kind of the skeptical paradox that can always be leveraged on everything. But let me just say that the right that the let's say the kind of the concept of rights within law, which I do think is as part of the inheritance of the cultural Christian drive, is probably best exemplified by freedom of association. Freedom of association was, in some sense, did not exist at the time in the Christian doctrine famously says, "Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar," but they contravene the law of the state. They break the law because the law is unjust, specifically because there is no right to freedom of association. So they practice freedom of association, even though it contravenes the law of the state, the law of the land. But they say, render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. So, and then the problem with freedom of association is that it contains its own potential self destruction, because freedom of association can lead to associations which are intolerant of freedom of association. So freedom of association potentially contains a kind of its own paradox, but that is a potential. It's a hypothetical contention. So you can't say, well, if you are for freedom of association, then you are for a never-ending worldly argument. That has to be litigated in the particular, not in the hypothetical. To say, oh well, if you're for freedom, then you're for bad things. I think that these things don't have to coincide, and this is why I say that the state should not be a bastion of enforcing a kind of sociological moral standard. That it should be tasked with a different kind of standard, ideally, and it should enshrine things like freedom of association. But like morality is something that has to be, let's say, litigated within the realm of hopefully a kind of a classically liberal tolerance of freedom of association. Anyway, so I just wanted to make that whole spiel because that is, you see, and you can't even, yeah, so you can kind of cynically say, well, you're just like everyone else then, because you are also trying to grab the reins of worldly law and impose some kind of standard or measure or something like that. And in some sense, I don't feel like I need to do that. It would be nice if people would be persuaded by my argument and could see the reason of it, and the necessity of it, or the preference of it, and that they would find it convincing. But that's not. In some sense, I think that this point that I'm making is something that just seems to me reasonable, and it doesn't matter if it's in force or not. It still, I think, stays as the reasonable position to take on these matters. So much so that it's worthy to respect that the world is not the same realm as the spirit, and that how the world should be governed with a certain level of respect for categorically dividing and not creating a homogeneous dominion and narrative, but that the spiritual realm should be private, essentially, and that we shouldn't essentially try to make the state a kind of sociological enforcement or theocratic. Again, I guess I'm sensitive to the argument. Well, I'm actually asking for a particular kind of secular form of government in order to facilitate a state of affairs that is amenable to the kind of model of theocracy that I have, which is just very peculiar and sophisticated and weird. I guess I am sensitive to that claim because I think that might be essentially true, but I think that that I could secularly defend my position not from a partisan spiritual philosophy, but just on the grounds of psychology, because corrupting these categorical distinctions, the bifurcation between a private, conscientious spiritual judgment and a public identity, if we don't keep these things separate, then we do, I think, precipitate very quickly an anti-liberal cultural fascism, where sort of everyone has to have a particular mark of their identity, that that everyone must show how they've been conditioned and imprinted and comport to a universal narrative, where there's this kind of objective. There's no discerning. There's just an objective judgment that is from an external locus of epistemic authority, that everyone has the same ego, that everyone is plugged into the same sort of ego structure. That is, what's the word? I was going to use a word that means like homogenized or something, but a monoculture, essentially, like a mono. And there is what is interesting is that perhaps produces, I mean, it does produce a certain, I mean, I guess now I'm about to sort of contradict a lot of things that I've said potentially, is that that can have potentially a certain pedagogical value to it when you are growing up, essentially, because if you can have a designated identity and let's say a given subconscious vehicle that that is a kind of homogenization of your being, that you don't have a private and a public identity, and in some sense this is what a lot of young juvenile people have as they are developing, as they are still to, because you have to have enough unconscious appreciation and fathoming the depths of the unconscious side of the mind before you can have a kind of an independent ego that can sustain itself. And then between the unconscious and the ego, uh, I mean, I do think that it is almost like quite a vast sort of journey of self-discovery that one has to sort of grow through and develop and mature out of. I do think that essentially the general line of development for an individual is, sort of culminates probably around 30, 30. I know I can, this is the one word I have problem pronouncing, or other people have problem. 50 and 30, 30. I don't. And I said 30. That is, I think, sort of the year of. I mean, this is to generalize. Anyway, and I mean, I think that there are certain forms of arrested development which people get stuck in a rut in the same way that, the Keegan stages of development, and saying that people are on this Keegan stage of development. So, I mean, a lot of people, I think, are maybe stuck in one of these stages that, so their age doesn't really help them get further along, except for maybe in some limited capacity, they gain some higher access to the next stage, but it's only in a very sort of compartmented fashion, or it's only in a very slight or subtle way. Anyway, what is my point? That it can be very helpful for young people to be growing up in the unified vision that there is one ego, that that as you are discovering that you that you're that it's sort of that your ego is not yours, it's part of a kind of universal creed, um, because then when you grow into your ego, sort of, it gives you the promise that you'll have this kind of this automatic um, access to sort of, or a passcode, that you will have a kind of universal passcode when your ego is fully manifested. And again, I mean, this is almost also a kind of description of the kind of the scientism sort of people. I'm somewhat straying from because I mean, this is also thematically similar to the whole homosexual thing, but the homosexual thing is much more. This is all self-contained. Like, in some sense, what I was just talking about, young juvenile people growing up into an idea of a universal ego or something like that, that they're awakening to and uncovering and developing. That's almost like, it's thematically very similar to the homosexual thing, but it is just kind of inverted, in that you are discovering the ego externally. Um, and this is under the rubric that your subconscious is part of an external narrative. And so you have a different kind of relationship to your own ego. Um, your ego isn't so much located within you. It's kind of it's almost a kind of mystical spirit that is inhabiting your culture or your society. It's kind of, it's part of the zeitgeist or something like that. It's not really personal. Whereas the sort of the homosexual thing is a weird kind of projection from the personal onto the exterior, in a kind of automatic fashion, where the outside environment is like a blank canvas for um, for playing out the internal ego structure, which is almost scientifically, morally investigated and deployed, from the subconscious sense of being, from the subconscious core identity or something like that. So it makes the external a reflection of the internal subconscious state. And it does so because there's something like the subjective feeling, which I've basically summarized as being a feeling of self-pity, is the basic intellectual scaffolding upon which judgment is premised and grounded and extrapolated from. Whereas, the idea that you are that you're part of a general narrative, which most people relent to in at least some compartmentalized way, or in some societal ways, um, which is in some sense what the concept of the world even is. Um, Being framed from some power that you don't have any kind of direct communication with, or uh, being the burden of some residue of some other's decision that you have um, no recourse or right of, or something like that. And the only way to bridge that divide is to create a kind of homogenization of some kind of, cosmic right that has some kind of reflection in the world, or in the flesh, or something like that. That there must be some mark to bridge the anyway. But the yearning for some kind of yeah, I mean, it's interesting because in some sense the what I've described as the sort of the homosexual subconscious constitution is that it's it wishes there to be a a narrative imposed in a kind of comprehensive. In some sense, they want there to be a general narrative that is on their side, or that is a partisan of their design of, so they're kind of wishing for a kind of fatalism to be imposed. They are want for some kind of determinism to be applied. So they have the criteria that it should fulfill, sort of held by a cynical ego, which is looking for sympathetic support and is being projected onto the environment to see where the environment falls short of that standard. So the ego is not so much a subjective frame of judgment so much as it is contending judgment of a kind of an objective reading of things. So I mean, I guess you could also perhaps describe it as a kind of amalgamation between the unconscious and the ego. That the ego and the unconscious have a weird kind of overlay. That the ego is brittle and potentially caustic. And the unconscious is just there to help to generalize the ego as a kind of, anyway, I mean, I was going to make it's amazing how, I guess so many of these mechanisms are so similar to one another that they all kind of bleed together. And, it's interesting because it's very easy that people can be self-aware of their own internal mechanism and grow some insight from it. And it's very easy how close things are to their opposites sometimes. The I think it's almost famous just how many homosexuals there have been in people trying to orchestrate large fascistic political projects. That the kind of the paternalism that is represented in the politics of of sort of the cultural values of fascistic cultures, the people of the KKK, how they're grand dragon wizards and all those sorts of things, just a lot of them have a lot of kooky psychological things about how they are tending to the psychological health of the members of their society and community, because without something like a kind of rigid caste system in order to scapegoat an outgroup and to divert pressure, within contending with a kind of external locus of control, there is no there is no way to sort of to keep order in their very compromised, sort of bargaining with the devil, as it were, or bargaining with the spirit of man, or sort of placating and trying to anyway. But I've already generalized, this thing that I call the homosexual inclination into how it kind of operates in many different realms and fields, and how many heterosexuals essentially have large components of this kind of thinking. It's just that, which I'm obviously expanding the concept of the homosexual mentality, whatever you want to call it, to be things that don't have anything to do with sexuality. But yeah, I mean, because there are a lot of people that indulge in some variant of self-pity, and in some sense that reactive mentality is represented in all sort of narrative crafting and things like that. But that it just, in some sense, it probably has to do with the age of when people, how early people developed at the same time that they developed an awareness, a conscious awareness of essentially when they were learning their gender, probably when they were starting to play the game, the enculturation of uh, which I mean has it's not just a cultural thing. I mean, this is also a I mean, I do think there's a large biological component to this, but essentially, I mean, young boys have a lot more testosterone than young girls, and the dynamics, the play dynamics, the social dynamics, and how adults are modeling things. Uh, I don't want to. This is going to be too much of a topic of its own that I'm going to have to reconstitute. But I mean, I gave very good recordings a long time ago about how you can, through the metaphor of sexual relations, um, create a whole version of how society uh, what was it? Man, I can't remember that exact thing. That oh yeah, well, so sort of just around the point of success in life, right? That at some point you have to orientate yourself towards some kind of goal or purpose. And as I've already said, that something what I count as the homosexual mentality is that the subconscious dominant function is essentially structuring its theme, its teleos, essentially around a kind of a self-pity, which means that it has to be deeply invested into some basic trauma or some basic obstacle that hinders one, and then you using everything in relation to that hindrance. And so everything can be more neatly gradiated, it can be more neatly categorized because you have a broad pillar in order to kind of cast a shadow, and everything can be in relation to that external obstacle, to that kind of sort of, if I could call it perhaps a metaphysical kind of oppositional scapegoat, because everything then is that becomes the linchpin to everything. But so if I say that well, people need a dream, they need a goal, they need some kind of thing to do in life. They need to, I mean, I think that it's usually around the age of 3 when human beings are basically dreaming up what their basic purpose is going to be, or it's at least when they are um, laying down their basic motivational framework, or they are setting up beliefs that are going to prime them and set them up to be that are going to be the defining characteristics or criteria that help them um, uh, choose which path to choose when they are given opportunities and paths and things like that. That these things are anyway. So I do think that there's a lot of important beliefs that are constructed around the age of 3, and I think that although sexuality is not on the radar of a 3-year-old, there is a deep understanding of gender, I think. Um, it's perhaps quite naive. It's perhaps quite it's not explicit. It's not, they can't talk about it necessarily intelligently, but they have made lots of beliefs and perception. I mean, 3-year-olds can't articulate necessarily. I mean, some can articulate, quite um, precociously, sort of profusely, and sort of. But but I'm just saying that there are going to be beliefs that have been constructed around those sorts of things that are quite sophisticated, even if they can't be articulated. Um, and although you won't be able to know exactly how those beliefs eventually develop and further progress into very obvious resultant pictures of how the genders correlate to one another, or the different types of gender expression and things like that, but you will have enough um examples and candidates through which to culminate into some awareness and appreciation of some spectrum of possibility and variance and things like that. And out of those images, out of those vague stereotypes, is going to be very important in it's a bank of metaphor through which one can construct one's meta purpose in life, one's or criteria for what one's goals are, what one's general objectives are in life. That these are the basic illustrations that populate the mind of a 3-year-old to work out what they want to attain to, what they want to reach towards, what how they can see themselves, what they admire in terms of what they would like to exemplify them in a 3-year-olds, I think, do have very strong sense of. I mean, again, this might not be so easily articulatable by each of them, but they do have strong drives of aspiration. Um, and the material that they have to construct these aspirations, I do think, are vaguely, if I can just look, I'm not going to describe it perfectly, but let's just call them gendered stereotypes. Gendered stereotypes are going to be a huge part of the palette of material used to think about and construct and permeate. In some sense, it's not so much that they're going to build themselves out of those colors, but they are going to. That is kind of like the snow globe of possible scenarios and possibilities, and how they might be constellated with one another, in the same way that little girls play with dolls, and they imagine how people fight with one another, and they imagine, little boys can also have a collection of these caricatures, these stereotypes, or these possible things in their mind, and they can plot and plan how they would have it ordered, how they would imagine themselves. So, I mean, perhaps how they are explored between the sexes is different, but it's essentially the same computation of how you generate criteria for having um, a meta purpose, or how you would measure your sense of success, or how you would measure um, being successful. And uh, uh, I mean, if you wanted, I mean, there's probably even a lot of literature within psychology that would. There's might be literature from all over the place which would maybe support what I'm saying, but terror management theory, I'm sure that that a 3-year-old is going to experience death denial, in the sense that they're going to have a coping mechanism of needing to have an identity that has a persistence, that has a success within the social environment that they have perceived to some degree and understood to some degree in certain categorical um, facets. And using those facets, they can work out how they want to be respected or treated um, or regarded through the pantheon of examples that they have witnessed and experienced, and have some appreciation thereof, at least in terms of how things are able to affect people through the medium of culture and interrelations in communities and societies, which are things that I think little children, 3-year-olds, are very adept at uh, monitoring and evaluating and witnessing and what's the word, um, making decisions about and forming beliefs on. Okay, and what I've tried to say is that the homosexual mentality essentially is that a lot of this is not, a lot of this consumption of these general purposes and beliefs are not constructed in the direct, immediate confrontation of them. They are digested indirectly through a self-pity, through an obstacle. So instead of having to formulate a generalized purpose, you are formulating or criteria, general criteria for what your purpose would be. Instead, you're generating criteria for how to withstand the onslaught of the obstacle, how to withstand the damage of some trauma or something like that, some persistent trauma, how to cope and develop a generalized plan of resistance. So the project is that of resistance. It's not that of... So anyway, the general criteria for success is general criteria for successful resistance. So this is, and that so I think that roughly around maybe 2 to 3 years old is when the... Anyway, so this stuff is also very much connected with this, I think, is the subconscious is at its prime developmental time, I think, around this age. And very early down in that foundational stack, the homosexual mentality is engaged in a project of resistance, whereas other people would have general purposes, general criteria, and then maybe they would reach some subject matter, and then in that subject matter they would get a reactive mentality and work out that everything is relative to an obstacle, and then they end up with a fetish or an obsession, or not even a fetish, but just a kind of a preoccupation and some kind of intellectual uh, um, that sort of becomes, let's say, a sort of a character quirk, or a and you also get this in certain forms of sort of religious orthodoxy, and but yeah, I mean, usually things that are sort of compartmentalized like that, are things that can be repaired quite easily. Um, but yeah, I would say you sort of salvaging the criteria of your general purposes, or at least consciously integrating them into beliefs that you consciously endorse because they are connected with your values, which you are reaffirming in real time. And there's another thing that I need to talk about, which is essentially then how does one comport all this stuff around self-determinism with a worldly identity and the need or the necessity of a kind of the capacity for an ironic attachment. Um, but anyway, I mean, I'm not going to go down that. But a really good way of reading something that talks about that is Vasti Ruud's work on Nietzschean nihilism, in her chapter in the book called On Nihilism. Sorry, I think the book is called Living with Nihilism, or her chapter is called Living with Nihilism. Sorry, one of the two. I think I will try to illustrate this issue of ironic attachment, which gets into some of these issues of paradoxes as well, which, I mean, this whole topic is very complicated. But essentially, one way that I've used to illustrate what I call this kind of, to get to the root of what I'm talking about when I talk about this homosexual mentality or something like that, or how to psychologically model it and explain it, is that imagine that you were driving in the middle of nowhere on very properly constructed roads, and there's an intersection that has traffic lights, and you can see that you are approaching the intersection, and let's say the terrain is very flat, there's nothing covered about. You can see how the other roads are connecting to this intersection, and you can see that there are no cars coming in the cross of the intersection. There's nobody else around as you approach the intersection. And then as you approach, the light signals that you should stop at the intersection. So in some sense, there's no good reason for you to stop other than the light is telling you to stop. So sort of if you just examine why would you stop, and so now if you stop at the light, I would, and this is not a perfect analogy. I would say that, because in some sense it doesn't matter if you stop at the light or if you don't stop at the light, but just for the purpose of the illustration, let me say that if you stop at the light, it's because of this homosexual mentality, essentially. That's an example of because that's not the true answer, but the technical answer is that it matters why you stopped or you didn't stop. Because, sort of in practice, you might find that is actually the sort of people who have this homosexual mentality are the ones who might not stop the most, because they are self-aware that, they're self-aware enough or insightful enough about their own internal mechanism, and then they can kind of ironically rebel against it, or because they're sort of so close to it. So it's interesting because of, let's say, you can sort of become so cynical that it ends up sort of reversing or inverting on itself. So I mean that sort of cynical in the sense of where the weight of intellectual sympathy is apportioned, which you can get into these kinds of almost reverse flow of expectation and obligation that But yeah, in general, I would say on someone isn't in a weird mood, that essentially that stopping at such an intersection would be, because in some sense it's an excuse to indulge in let's say in the self-pity, in the intellectual sympathy. Well, um, stewing in the necessity that everyone should be roped into the same intellectual sympathy, and that everyone should follow the rules, because it's important that everyone have this this blanket um, sort of conformity to a reasonably mediated general ego judgment. Whereas why I use this to describe that this is the basic engine of the homosexual mentality is that how does that serve your teleological criteria of a purpose? Like where is the, how does that how is it helpful? How is it useful? Where does it lead? It's sort of, it's just not convenient for the sake of intellectual sympathy. It's just indulging in something that's not practical. It's not fruitful. It doesn't lead, but I mean, obviously I'm not saying that people that stop at lights that they don't have to stop at are let's say under the spell of this mentality. Maybe they're thinking in their head something else. Maybe they are just looking at the signal to stop, and they're sort of, their head is clouded with thinking about other things, and they don't even, they uh, they don't have the enough free attention to confirm that it is actually safe, and it's not useful to stop, and it's safe to go through. They might essentially be self-distracted by their own thoughts to some degree. Whereas, but I'm saying that if you conscientiously stop, um, sorry, this thought experiment is sort of so confusing in itself, putting all these caveats in. But I do think that that's a pretty good illustration of what it is that it's interesting. I mean, to point out the issue of practicality and convenience. That is also actually what the scriptures say about it in Romans 1, that it's not convenient. Um, and I would argue that the descriptions in Romans 1 are very psychological. Where it says that because of the knowledge of God has been excluded from people. What is God? God is love. So the knowledge of God has been rejected in some sense, and then God has given them a reprobate. God gives them a reprobate mind to do those things that are not convenient. Um, I'm somewhat paraphrasing, but yeah. So I do think it is connected with this. A lot of generally early beliefs around the age of 2 and 3 uh, that have to do with how one garners knowledge of the world in respect of a sense of self-pity, rather than a sense of um, beliefs that are actualizing values that are consciously held in reverence or consciously affirmed, which is also a topic that's in Vasti Root's uh, on nihilism chapter, or living with nihilism, where you know, we don't have an excuse for holding the values that we hold. We have to choose to hold them with no epistemic reliabilism to explain our choice. We have to freely choose our values, and then we have integrated beliefs with those values, and then we have to watch our beliefs carefully, that we haven't created contradictions and traps for ourselves. And anyway, and the general tactic of self-pity, essentially, which ends up constellating things in relation to a common enemy or a common obstacle or a common existential quandary, which everyone is under the thumb there too, or something like that, means that your subjective appreciation of that becomes the main sort of palette in which one understands the world itself, which ends up, I think, creating a kind of compartmentalization of spiritual togetherness. I do think that I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but this is why intimacy becomes such a barbed wired sort of exercise in a kind of self-abuse for those with the homosexual mentality. Um, because those core beliefs are only accessed autistically or solipsistically. Anyway, I've spoken about this earlier in the recording. I'm not going to repeat that stuff. Anyway, I mean, I did for a little bit talk about sort of the inverse of the same apparatus in terms of people that live in a narrative, and that they are uncovering their ego externally, as if there is a sacred, all-powerful ego that people can plug into, that they are learning about externally. Where, in some sense, the inverse of that is that in the homosexual thing, that the ego already is self-contained and pristine, and it's just the projection and lining up the environment with the internal pristine ego that is lacking, and that becomes a kind of usually a political or sociological sort of project of fitting in. Or fitting it into society or culture. I mean, and this is what homosexuals have always perennially complained about, is fitting in. And in some sense, the only way to facilitate them fitting in is to create a bubble of sort of automatic acceptance within a kind of, which is a very vulgar form of acceptance, or crude form of acceptance. What I just mean is that it's very externalized. It's not, it has to be ostentatious in some sense. There has to be very visceral, subconscious tokens of it, proof of it, evidence of it, externally. And then the inverse, I think, is something that is usually an ordinary part of development. It's sort of that these bubbles of looking for an external ego. I mean, that in some sense, well, when you are a young juvenile individual, you have to have a way of dealing with parts of the world, parts of subject matter, which you don't yet understand, you don't yet know. And so it's kind of put in this narrative fairy tale cocoon to be filled in later, perhaps, or to be collapsed and developed later. And so, um, and this might also have to do with, what in the developmental psychology realm is called, sort of I can't remember exactly what it's called, but the sort of the naive narcissism phase. Um, the first narcissism, that is the natural sort of stage of juvenile development. So I think I've got a description of it there that I've just sort of produced. But which is perhaps also a necessary cocoon in order to set up the more important structures which have, as I say, positive, affirmative, direct criteria of one's sense of purpose and success. That one is setting up broad groundwork for one's yes. I mean, the more I talk about this, the more I start to see how the subconscious, I think, is essentially a very important touchstone for talking about the development of many psychopathologies like narcissism. I can start to see how narcissism fits into this, and also how you could perhaps talking about borderline in these kinds of terms, with obviously with different things happening, but very thematically related to these kinds of topics and things like that, because obviously in much more extreme ways, because sort of the full-blown narcissist is going to I don't even want to start opening that can, but that the narcissist is not going to have that pristine bubble of cocoon of narrative that helps to insulate general criteria. In fact, they're going to have the opposite of that, and the lack of that and the wish for that is going to lead to a specialized form of self-pity. Although it's not to do with self-pity, it's it's a mechanical coping mechanism, in some sense, that the parental figure or the source of trauma or abuse is just going to be that you're going to kind of make a cocoon or an insulation out of that, which becomes, in some sense, the fabric of the false self. That you're just kind of, sort of, you're going to be a fish in water of the trauma. So you're never going to develop a subconscious that can actually have a cohesive and eventually, hopefully, bifurcated, sort of structure. Instead, you're always just going to have you're going to go straight into some kind of homogenized blurring of the two, and the combination of what that natural bifurcation would be is that the one component is always going to be outsourced. Um, which probably has a very sophisticated ways of describing it in terms of the other sides of the mind and parts of those other sides of the mind, um, which will mirror what is happening in the subconscious of what I've just basically gone over. So, I mean, this is somewhat the problem with my theory, is that it has a holistic nature to it. And so, you know, when you're talking about something in a psychopathology, you have reflections of the same mechanism in the various sides of the mind happening simultaneously, which then also will give rise to particular or peculiar forms of feedback and, sort of, let's say, internal resonance or amplification of kind of internal tension or antagonism or something like that, or particular kinds of properties of symptomology. Anyway, now I'm just rambling, so let me stop this recording. But yeah, I think I've talked about this enough. It's hard for me to talk about this without going into these other ulterior topics like addiction and intimacy, because they do seem to be so very closely correlated in topic, at least, or in theme. Okay, now this is an addendum, just to sort of elaborate on some of the issues that I spoke on. So just to kind of give more of a comprehensive or overview of some of these topics in context, that just riffing on two major themes or concepts, which is the practicality, the ironic attachment, and practicality being linked with convenience, or with things that are not convenient. So if you have an ironic attachment to worldly identity and worldly forms, as it were, which is in some sense one of the great categories in what I generally say is an important way that you must have your beliefs bifurcated. You have to have your beliefs about worldly identity and your beliefs about your private spiritual judgments, that they have to, it's very important to get all of this stuff properly ordered, because in some sense it's very hard to get self-determinism and an internal locus of control up and running. You have to know how to deal with that in the context of beliefs, and in some sense then issues of time, past, present, and future. How because you can have beliefs about beliefs, beliefs about time, time and place, and sort of this can create paradoxes in itself, and blah blah blah. But anyway, sorry, not going down that rabbit hole right now, but having an ironic attachment to your worldly identity and to things like that, in some senses, because it's just a conduit, it's just an earthen vessel, it's just a vehicle for allowing the spirit to access things like communication, which always has to be in some incarnated form, has to be, well, I mean, when I say it always has to be, the medium is not the message here. That the spiritual discerning, the spiritual vision, the spiritual judgment, that is always, sort of prime and pristine, but it does have to ironically be packaged in some worldly envelope. And then there's a weird kind of middle ground in terms of how that envelope is distinguished enough that it can be in perhaps a shared spiritual culture, how it can be opened. Anyway, so if you have an ironic attachment to these worldly forms and things like that, this is essentially the necessity of law, in some sense, that there are some general conventions, some general categorical distinctions that we make about the material world, the external locus of control, or something like that, that things are ordered well enough so that we can plug our spiritual discerning into it, that it's sort of that we need some kind of conventional conformity on some level, because otherwise we don't have language. So the word, the meaning, the significance, which we can actually have in our minds and that we can see in the light of our purposes and our values and things like that, need matter. They need objects, so that we can use them as a medium to connect with one another. Anyway, I mean, this gets much. I mean, I'm doing it on such an abstract, metaphysical sort of level, talking about this, but sort of, this gets slightly more complicated when you are, sort of talking about habits as opposed to just immediate objects. When you're talking about behavior and you're talking about relationships over time. And one of, I think, the important instruments of the spiritual self-determinism, or let's say the internal locus of control, is that it is situated in the present. Foremost, it has direct control over the present, but that it does extend its reach into the future in some hopeful sense, in some faithful mechanism, but that faith is also part or built on top of essentially one's ability to have goals and plans, and to have one's own plans. And so, when we come up against the material forms of the world and worldly identities, we don't try to smash them with a sledgehammer. We don't try to sort of remake the external environment. We seek to convincingly negotiate, to engage, to participate, and that is how we enter that arena. And in some sense, those who have a plan are more empowered than those that don't have a plan. So in some sense, in as much as the worldly identity is comprised of not immediate intentions, but as sort of that you don't believe what you say that you believe, but you believe what it is that you actually do, and what you do is something that plays out over a course of a paradigm of the dimension of time, rather than just that the character that it takes over the fullness of its fruitfulness, or something like that. Where do things lead? In the constitution of the purpose involved, the workings of the activity, not just the immediate pretense or superficial ostensible label that it self-describes. So where are these things leading to? Where are they going to? And so, and this is essentially what makes this is what makes homosexuality problematic, is because, in some sense, indulging in, let's say, something that, if you take my model of it, that it is essentially fundamentally premised in a subconscious core theme of self-pity, and relating things to this external locus of control, which is in some sense sort of parameterizing that everything is happening in the shadow cast by this commonality of some held obstacle, and that sharing intimate space in that context, therefore, is in some sense a kind of to subjugate yourself to some kind of model of a narrative which is subjectively portended and held within the thing that the reality tunnel that you're sort of plugging yourself into, which is anyway. When you're connecting deeply with someone that has that kind of, or you're exploring that structure, you know, it's kind of like a diversion into a pocket universe or something like that, where things are safe and stable, where essentially whatever the sort of the intellectual sympathy and the obsession is, or the theme is, it creates, in some sense, the promise of this whole kind of project is that it creates a built-in value in terms of the resistance value, or the resilience, or something like that, that's being explored, the coping mechanism that's being explored, that makes one safe from this prime trauma, or this prime obstacle in what is, so in some sense it's kind of like the subconscious has taken on anyway, that kind of resistance that you're exploring, or something like that, essentially it doesn't lead to any kind of practical fruitfulness. It's an involution. It's an inception into a kind of like a make-believe diversionary sort of fantasy of some kind of safety from a kind of hypothetical problem. And that's really what the problem is that the kind of hypothetical problem that this whole version of reality is premised on is perhaps not without some intellectual merit. You could use this tactic, this model, in the same way that science is that the scientific method can be used to simulate some test from which that you can, derive some utility, or you can get it to do something reliably, but it's an approximation. It doesn't actually give you any truth that you can stand on, but it gives you some kind of built-in utilitarian promise, or something like that. Anyway, what it does though is it means that your own values at their base are a mimicry of a defense strategy, or something like that. Anyway, and so if you're bonding with someone in the shadow of some sense of self-pity, or some sense of coping with some arc evil force, that whole project becomes often an addictive kind of obsession, because you're just permeating or looking through different iterations of the same kind of what it was in some sense an investigation into the depths of that self-pity. It's sort of anyway, so it's like a spiral, a vortex, a kind of abyss, and it doesn't lead anywhere. It just leads you further into a kind of diversion, which is essentially just not fruitful. But it is something that it can continue in its own steam to try to outdo itself, or try to reincarnate itself, or try to re-stimulate itself. Now, what's interesting is that this whole thing can somewhat be a lesson in ironic attachment, in the necessity of ironic attachment. That we see the necessity that things need to be contained in some material outward package, some form, some envelope. But what's important is the message in the envelope, as it were. It's not the outer covering, but in some sense, how you can't divorce the one from the other. Therefore, we need an ironic attachment, and that there are formalities which well, if we stop producing envelopes, then there's no more communication in this. This is a bit of an analogy of communication using the material world. So the necessity of envelopes means we need to have production of envelopes, needs that we need to promote and conserve the material basis or something like that, that we need to replenish the earth. Anyway, and diversion and things that are not convenient are essentially... Anyway, this is not an argument for, I think Romans 1 is taken incredibly out of context when at the end of Romans 1 it talks about that these people deserve death. When you continue to read Romans from chapter 2, it talks about the importance not to judge other people. So it's making a point here. It's not actually talking about sociological enforcement of these values or of this kind of condemnation. That's not the point. In fact, I do think that what is contained in Romans 1 is a very psychological rendition of the actual mechanism, which I think I have more elaborately gone over to some degree. Anyway, so my point is so the need for ironic attachment, which is part of essentially the need of respecting, let's say, certain practicality that, and let me just show you then how you can sort of use this measure of practicality quite usefully, is that, well, if you have a kind of sexual diversion or something like that, what does this do? Does this project of indulging in this kind of self-pity, does it not poison the ability to have a fruitful friendship? Does it not obviate or negate or create an obstacle to something that would be more convenient and beneficial and fruitful, and something that would, what purport, what teleological framework is being obviated by the indulgence into this, or by cultures that fall into intellectual sympathy with this. So, I mean, this is... So, I mean, yeah, I'm very sensitive to the promulgation of intellectual sympathy, because I do think that essentially that is, in some sense, that is the... I mean, as I said, this mechanism doesn't just exist within homosexuals, that this is a generic human condition type of problem which has affected some individuals at a very deep level of the construction of their own subconscious, but it usually is involved on some level it's involved in people's subconscious, in some subject matter, in some sphere or compartmented area. And the more compartmented one's beliefs are, especially if one has an external locus of control, or if one doesn't believe that it's possible to have an internal locus of control, it becomes a lot easier to sort of maintain some kind of fundamental belief incongruence and sort of implicit or innate cognitive dissonance, and a kind of haphazard subconscious, sort of um, menagerie or whatever. I mean, also what is mentioned in Romans 1, which is something that I think I have spoken about in other recordings, which is essentially I mean, this is not a correct technical way of talking about it, but essentially a kind of the spiritual toxin of what I've called sort of animal husbandry. That when people anthropomorphize animals, um, when they identify with the creature um, instead of the creator. Uh, anyway, anyway, this is perhaps too much of a tangent, but it is thematically quite connected to this. But anyway, um, I mean, this is a theme that I often that I've spoken about a long time ago, essentially about how morality itself has taken on different dimensions of depravity because of the extension of moral consideration, a kind of moral consideration, to animals, which, and I mean, I'm not against a kind of benevolence and, sort of, and standards of animal care, but to the extent to which that we see animals as morally equivalent to human beings, which have the capacity of uh, that even if they don't yet have uh, so I'm trying to remember the words that I used to describe this, because there's sentience, and what's the other word that I use? Oh, this is embarrassing. I've forgotten this whole topic, but essentially there are two basic concepts that are important, which is that someone has the capacity to have an internal locus of control and a self-determinism, and that someone, because most people don't have that, but they have the capacity to attain it. People have philosophically given up their own self-determinism to an external locus of control, to a narrative, but they are still sentient. They still have the capability of attaining that. So um, yeah, so there's sort of, I can't remember the words that I used to use, but there was a word that basically means the capability of attaining free will, and the other thing is essentially um, so yeah, I define sentience as having the capacity to possess free will, uh, even though that they might not. Uh, they are still morally accountable because they are sentient as well. Um, so they are accountable for their irresponsibility. Uh, they're not acting responsibly, but they are still. Their sentience makes them accountable. Um, anyway, this is perhaps a bit too tangential, but thematically it was relevant because in a society where spiritual discerning, when reason, when understanding doesn't become generally understood or generally known or received as common sense, as being, the thing that makes human beings special, the human beings that gives them their moral agency, but also their agentic dignity and integrity, when that becomes displaced by, well, animals are just as morally valuable as what we are, as what sentient life is. This is a kind of fraud, or it's a kind of make-believe narrative, which is, I think, sort of incredibly depraved and fundamentally, it denigrates the knowledge of God in some deep, profound way. But which is also why I think that there are fundamental problems with. This is going to sound, but it can, I think, be. Look, it's not that it's categorically bad, but for people to have pets is not itself a bad thing. But if they, let's say, anthropomorphize the pets, as it were, and the pets are just as morally valuable as human beings, this is. Yeah, this is. I mean, I'd have to go into it more in a more detailed psychological sense, because now I'm just taking it from a kind of thematic, societal almost sense. But what's going on there in the psychology of an individual who is doing that is that they are doing something to the status of their own, let's say, categorical bifurcation. They have a kind of homogenized, worldly, um, worldly entrenched subconscious. Um, they are certainly living in some kind of story, and let's say the moral character of that story, or the the overarching fatalism of that story, has got something of the animal's essence imbued into the image of that divine providence of that narrative realm. And so there is there is a problematic merger in terms of the nature of one's own intellect is being intellectually sympathetic with some qualia of the creature, of the particular sort of creature. And this, I think, is spiritually it's half baked, if I can put it like that. And it's certainly interesting that, especially in herd animals, you can see, it's even scripturally, they're even described spiritually as that um, uh, they are made in the image of themselves. I think is how they are described. They are sorry, after they're made after their own kind. Whereas the beasts are made after itself or himself or something it's I'm kind of butchering it. I should probably go look at Genesis, but that there is something about sort of herd animals that they have a vision of a kind of collective which the reproduction within that system, or within that natural order is that they are conserving some herd mentality in nature. Uh, I'm kind of not doing this justice. I should probably go and find the particular distinctions, but sort of there are, life is somewhat divided into sort of creeping things and herds and beasts that are sort of more solitary, and how they are described as essentially propagating them. They have different seemingly have different natures, and I think that the natures of these creatures can be are not as noble and as properly sophisticated as the human psychology. And if you implant yourself into those setups, because I think that it's perhaps even a slight misreading, because in some sense it almost sounds like man is very much like the herd animal, because the herd animal takes after their own kind, and man also takes after its own kind. But the kind that man is in the image of God. So there's a much higher level of kind there. And the kinds of the different herd animals, and the kind of those things therefore represent, I think, models of communal behavior which society could be poisoned by, could be tempted into mimicking or replicating through looking at an animal and saying, oh, the dignity of this, or the commonality of how they but when that is imported into the human mind, it is an unthinking sentiment. It is just, let's say, a subconscious valence. It's just a kind of it's just a it's just a painted mask, and an idea of how these masks would it's sort of in the same way that you could imagine a different scene of dolls playing together, that you could imagine a different set of figurines that have a different anyway. So I think that having things that have not been proven by chosen conscious value ascription and beliefs that comport with that, and having a residue of inherited indulgence into residue of traditional and historical artifacts of emulating and mimicking sort of groundless sentiments, or inherited anyway. the best way to cut through this stuff is ironic attachment. Is basically the defense against falling into some kind of inherited pattern of cyclical or other such process of unconsciousness or whatever it may be, or some kinds of assumed investment into some vestige, into some intrinsic status. But getting into particulars of sort of worldly identity and status is fraught with I think ironic detachment is a very high bar of deliberate, considerate application of one's what's the word? I can't think of the word. It means sort of oh my word, I think it's the Stoic thing. Or it's a virtue ethics thing, I can't remember. Something like equiposition or something like that, or, oh my word. I mean, this is a made-up word, but I think the actual word that I mean, this is a bit of a made-up word, but equisality. That we have to see. Oh well, the very pretty person that goes through life having everything handed to them, well, that comes with the burden of making some lessons in life easier to learn and other lessons in life harder to learn, and it sort of makes growing older perhaps more of a challenge to have cleared, sort of which is it's not, because it's not. I don't want to give off the impression that everyone has an equal footing and that everyone has an equal burden and everyone has an equal this, but that there's an equisality around, in some sense. I mean, this is why also participation matters, but there's a certain, it's something like understanding that there is action in inaction and inaction in action all the time, and in action and inaction, we can be or aiming to be perfect in our service to some highest duty, and into the values that we carry the faith of. And so it sort of behooves us to get our beliefs in order and aligns, with our principles and such. I think principles are how you take values and you put them into practice. They come into the implementation phase, and there is a lot of knowledge, I think, and experience that is needed in order to refine one's understanding of principles themselves. But anyway, this is and where there are gaps in people's principles, there are mysteries to be uncovered, and pedagogy to be had. I'm kind of going off all over the place, but yeah, did I finish this point about the faith in one's ability, in one's control and self-determinism, with planning, with immediate intellectual direct engagement and participation. That way, I think we can weight that self-determinism is the edge that is presented to us in the equality of shared experience. And then I think, there is joy in that basic setup that essentially, peace, joy, and contentment in the Holy Ghost. Which I think is also emphasized in Romans chapter 1 or chapter 2. It talks about the fatherhood of God. Anyway, okay. I think I've rambled on for long enough.